They were a quiet family, the kind you'd never expect to be the center of a mystery. The Millers lived deep in the Pennsylvania countryside, in a modest white farmhouse surrounded by open fields, with a gravel road that barely saw traffic. They were part of the local Amish community known for their strong faith, simplicity, and tight-knit way of life. To outsiders, their world seemed peaceful, untouched by the rush of modern life. But in the summer of 1992, something happened that shattered that calm. One morning, just as the sun crested over the hills, the Miller family vanished. No warnings, no signs of struggle. One moment they were there, the next, they were gone. The story began like any other quiet day in the community. Neighbors remembered seeing Eli Miller, the father, hitching up the horses for a supply trip. His wife Mary was inside baking bread, while their 5 children were doing chores outside. Nothing unusual. That evening, however, when the Millers didn't show up for Sunday gathering, people noticed. At first, they assumed the family had gone to visit relatives in another district. But as days passed and no word came, concern turned to fear. When elders visited the Miller home, they found the table set for dinner, the baby's blanket folded neatly on the cradle, and a loaf of bread cooling on the windowsill. Everything was in its place, except the family. Local authorities were contacted. But because the Amish typically avoid outside involvement, the investigation moved slowly. There were no footprints beyond what you'd expect around a farm, no signs of forced entry, and no clear evidence of foul play. The barn was locked, tools untouched, and the family's buggy was parked in its usual spot. It was as if the entire family had simply stepped out for a moment and never came back. The lack of clues frustrated both the community and the investigators. Whispers of strange events began to spread. Some spoke of an outsider seen near the property days before the disappearance. Others mentioned unfamiliar tire tracks leading into the woods behind the farmhouse. But nothing could be confirmed. As weeks turned into months and then years, the case went cold. What made this case even more haunting was the complete absence of motive. The Millers had no enemies. They weren't wealthy. They weren't involved in any sort of conflict. Even within the community, the family was described as gentle, hardworking, and kind. There was no reason, at least none that anyone could understand, for them to simply disappear without a trace. As time passed, the house was left untouched. The community, out of respect, maintained the property, trimming the grass and airing out the rooms from time to time. But the mystery of what happened to the Millers never left their minds. 10 years later, in 2002, the case was all but forgotten to the outside world. Life had moved on, though the Miller home still stood like a ghost from another time. But something unexpected happened that brought the mystery back into the light. It was a cool autumn afternoon when one of the older members of the community, Samuel Yoder, was walking along the edge of the woods near the old Miller property. He'd taken that path many times over the years, but this time, something caught his eye: a piece of bright yellow fabric hanging from a branch, half hidden under brush and leaves. It was odd because nothing in their community was that color. When he pulled it free, his heart skipped. It was a safety vest, the kind worn by police or construction workers. Stamped across the back, clear as day, was the word police. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a discarded vest, maybe lost from a passing road crew. But to the Amish, it was completely out of place. No one in their community would own such an item, let alone wear one. The vest was weathered, faded from years of exposure, but still intact. It hadn't been there the day before, at least. No one had noticed it. Samuel took the vest to the elders, who were just as puzzled. Why would a police vest be found deep in the woods, so close to where the Millers disappeared? It didn't take long for people to remember something unusual. From the past, an anonymous caller, months after the Millers vanished, had claimed to have seen a man dressed as an officer near the property. The tip was dismissed at the time, assumed to be a mistake or someone looking for attention. But now, with the discovery of the vest, that old rumor suddenly felt far more real. Could someone have posed as an officer to gain the family's trust? Was this vest a forgotten clue, something overlooked in the early days of the investigation? Word spread quickly, not just through the Amish community, but to nearby towns and eventually the media. The case was reopened, and new questions emerged. For the first time in a decade, there was a lead, fragile and uncertain, but a lead nonetheless. Investigators began re-interviewing people, searching old logs, and combing through the woods again. And as they dug deeper, they began to uncover strange inconsistencies in the original report. Witness statements that didn't quite add up, files that had been marked missing. Even a retired officer who remembered being told to stop looking into the case. The Miller family's disappearance had always been a mystery. But now it seemed it might not have been random at all. What if it was planned? What if someone had gone to great lengths to make the family disappear and had managed to keep it hidden for all these years? The discovery of that single piece of clothing raised more questions than answers. But it also did something else. It reopened hope that the truth might finally come to light. What really happened that day in 1992? Who was behind the Millers' vanishing? And why did a police vest, a full decade later, appear like a whisper from the past? The answer may be closer than anyone imagined. But as with all things buried in time, digging it up could reveal more than just the truth. Stay with us, because what comes next will change everything. As investigators started digging into the old case again, a new generation of officers took over, ones who weren't involved in the original search. One of them, a young detective named Rachel Hayes, had grown up just an hour from the Amish region. She'd heard about the Miller family disappearance when she was a child. It had always stayed in the back of her mind. One of those stories that adults whispered about when they thought no one was listening. Now, years later, she was sitting in the very house that had stood untouched for a decade, trying to feel what the family might have felt in their final moments there. The house hadn't changed much. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, but everything was still in place. The kitchen table was still there with faded placemats, and a children's wooden toy sat abandoned in the corner of the living room. Rachel walked slowly through each room, imagining what that last day must have been like. There was no sign of panic, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. It was as though the family had stepped outside and simply never came back. She took a picture of the window above the sink. It was slightly cracked, the way old glass settles over time. But there was something odd. The latch looked recently disturbed, not rusted over like the rest of the fittings in the house. She made a note and continued on. In the baby's room, she paused again. The cradle was empty, of course, but there were scratch marks on the floor beneath it, like it had been dragged out of place and then put back. It was subtle, but to someone looking closely, it raised more questions. Back in town, Rachel met with Samuel Yoder, the man who had found the vest. He was in his 70s now, with a slow, thoughtful way of speaking. He told her about the day he found the vest and how strange it was to him. But it was what he said next that truly made her stop and listen. Samuel remembered after the family disappeared, hearing something late at night a few days later, strange engine sound, not like a buggy. Something low and steady, like a generator or a larger truck. At the time, he'd thought it was just a passing vehicle, but now he wondered if it had been connected. The Amish, for the most part, remained silent. They didn't want outside attention, and the elders were cautious about reopening old wounds. But one of the Miller children's cousins, a woman named Leah, who had since left the community, agreed to speak. She was only 16 at the time of the disappearance, but she remembered her Aunt Mary clearly. She said the last time she visited the farm, Mary had seemed distracted and settled even. She wouldn't say much, but she mentioned something about a man who came by pretending to be lost, asking odd questions. Mary had written it off, but Leah remembered her mentioning the man wore a badge and carried a clipboard. Rachel took this information back to the department, and they began checking through archived call logs from 1992. That's when they found something else unusual. A 911 call had been placed from a payphone near the edge of the Amish district that year. The caller had refused to give their name, but said, "Something is wrong at the Miller farm." The call was logged and marked as untraceable back then due to limited technology. No officer ever followed up, not officially, at least. The deeper Rachel looked, the stranger it all became. One of the original officers assigned to the case had died just 2 years after the investigation stalled in what was ruled an accident. Another had quietly left law enforcement altogether. It could have been coincidence, but there were just too many threads that didn't lead anywhere, or maybe they led somewhere no one had ever wanted to look. Meanwhile, Rachel kept thinking about the vest. It was the only physical clue that had surfaced in 10 years, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been placed there on purpose. Maybe it had been hidden for years, only to be uncovered by a storm or shifting brush. Or maybe someone had come back, someone who wanted the vest to be found. Either way, it changed everything. Forensics couldn't pull much from it. The vest was too old, exposed to weather, and any DNA it might have had was long gone. But they did find a small tear in the fabric, and lodged in that tear was a sliver of plastic, a fragment that, when tested, was consistent with the kind of badge holders used by law enforcement. It wasn't proof, but it was more than they'd had in years. Rachel returned to the community again, hoping to speak with more people. She learned that, just weeks before the Millers disappeared, there had been another strange incident. One that hadn't been reported at the time. A different Amish family nearby had been visited late at night by a man claiming to be from the government. He said he was doing a welfare check. The father had refused to let him in, and the man left without trouble. But the description matched what Mary had told her niece. Same kind of badge, same calm voice, same clipboard. Who was this man? Was he part of something larger? Was he acting alone? There were too many unanswered questions. But one thing was becoming clear. This wasn't a random event. Someone had gone out of their way to target the Millers. And for what? They had no money, no known enemies. Was it something they saw, or something they knew? Rachel began looking into land records. Maybe the answer had to do with the property itself. The Millers' land bordered a stretch of dense woods and ran alongside a stream that fed into a nearby lake. It wasn't valuable in a traditional sense, but it was private, secluded. Perfect for someone trying to do something without being seen. Then she found a curious record. A nearby plot of land had changed hands shortly after the disappearance. Bought by an out-of-town company that didn't seem to exist anymore. The signature on the documents was illegible, and the contact address led to a mailbox in another state. Piece by piece. The story was unraveling, but it was still far from making sense. Rachel stood once more in the Miller house, looking out the same window Mary had likely gazed through 1,000 times. The wind rustled the trees gently, and the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the empty room. Somewhere out there, someone knew the truth. Maybe they had hoped the past would stay buried. But the past has a way of resurfacing, especially when it's tied to a mystery that refuses to fade. Rachel wasn't sure what would come next. All she knew was that this was no longer just a missing persons case. It was something more. Something hidden behind quiet faces and silent fields. And now that the truth had started to show itself, there was no turning back. The real story was only just beginning. Rachel started noticing something strange as she kept digging. Every time she tried to pull public records connected to the land near the Miller farm, files were either incomplete or marked restricted. That didn't sit right with her. This was a decade-old missing persons case. Involving an Amish family, what could possibly need redacting? Even more puzzling, a few of her recent search queries began triggering access warnings in her department's system. At first, she thought it was a glitch. But when she casually mentioned it to a senior officer, his reaction was too quick, too dismissive, like he already knew what she was going to say. He waved it off, told her to let it rest and focus on more current investigations. It was the first real sign that someone might not want this case reopened, while Rachel continued her quiet work behind the scenes. Another thread was starting to unravel just a few towns over. A local reporter named Thomas Greer, who ran a small independent news blog, had caught wind of the reopened Miller file. Thomas had always believed there was more to that case than anyone admitted. His father had once worked construction near the Amish region and claimed he'd seen unmarked vehicles and strangers in uniform around that time, strangers who didn't belong. At the time, Thomas thought his dad was just being paranoid. But with the vest now part of the evidence, everything he'd once doubted suddenly felt possible. Thomas reached out to Rachel, requesting an off-the-record meeting. She was hesitant at first, but something about his questions made her pause. He wasn't just chasing headlines, he seemed genuinely invested. They met at a diner outside town, in a booth near the window, where they could keep an eye on who came and went. Thomas brought a folder with him, filled with old newspaper clippings, property maps, and a handwritten letter dated 1993. The letter was from a woman named Esther Lanson, another Amish woman who had written to a family friend expressing fear about a man who had been seen multiple times near the edge of their fields. She described him as polite, quiet, and not quite right. The way he stared, the way he knew people's names before they introduced themselves. That letter had never made it to authorities. It had been hidden in an attic, found by Thomas. During a visit with the Lance family while researching another story, Rachel studied the letter closely. This man, whoever he was, had been watching other families too. The Millers might not have been the first family he visited, just the ones who disappeared. A new question emerged. Was this just about the Millers, or was it part of something bigger? Meanwhile, back in the Amish community, not everyone was happy about the renewed attention. Some of the elders believed the mystery should remain in the hands of God, not the English world. But a few of the younger generation, especially those who had left the order or were considering leaving, wanted answers. Among them was a young man named Caleb Miller, the eldest Miller child's cousin, who had left the community at 18. He hadn't spoken much about what happened, but when he heard the case was active again, he contacted Rachel. He said there was something he remembered from the summer of the disappearance, something he'd been too afraid to talk about until now. Caleb had been staying with the Millers for a few weeks that year. He'd always felt like an outsider, curious about the world beyond their farmland. One night, he woke up to faint voices coming from outside. It was past midnight. He looked out the window and saw a man in a uniform standing near the barn, speaking with Eli Miller. The man handed Eli something, a clipboard, or maybe a file, and gestured toward the woods. Caleb thought it was strange, but when he asked about it the next morning, Mary told him it was nothing, just someone from the township. He never questioned it again. But now he remembered the unease in her voice, how she kept the children close for the rest of that day, how she locked the door at night, something they almost never did. Rachel pressed Caleb for more details, but his memories were hazy. Still, it was more than they'd had before. The image of the man in uniform kept coming back, a figure who used trust as a disguise. The theory began forming more clearly. Someone with knowledge of how to approach isolated families. Someone who knew the language, who could blend in just enough not to raise alarms. It could have been someone from law enforcement or someone pretending to be. More records were pulled, more names came up, and yet nothing pointed to a single suspect. But there was one clue they kept returning to. A missing police badge reported in 1992. A small-town officer named Mark Ellis had filed a report that his badge was lost, possibly stolen. The case was dismissed quickly, just another clerical mishap. But Rachel wasn't so sure anymore. When she looked into Mark's background, she found that he had left the force not long after, moved out of state, and dropped off the map. There was no record of employment, no updated address, just a sudden end to his trail. Thomas started digging too, and his research led him to an old motel near the county line that had closed in the late 90s. The owner at the time remembered someone staying there. Under a false name, someone who wore a badge but never gave details. He kept to himself, always paid in cash, and left without notice. The timeline matched the summer of the disappearance. Still, nothing was solid, just fragment stories, letters, memories. But the unease was growing. Rachel found herself waking in the night, her thoughts spinning. What if they were getting too close? What if someone was still out there, watching? If this person had evaded attention for so long, they clearly knew how to stay hidden. And if they thought the truth was about to come out, there was no telling what they'd do. The community grew quieter as the whispers spread. Some believed the Millers had been taken. Others thought they'd left by choice to escape something none of them understood. But the signs didn't point to escape. They pointed to planning, to someone calculating every move. Rachel stood in front of the Miller house again one evening, the sun low behind her, casting long shadows across the porch. She looked at the front door, at the window where the curtain still hung half-torn, and felt it in her chest, that cold, creeping feeling of unfinished stories and unanswered questions. Whatever had happened here wasn't an accident, and someone, somewhere, knew exactly why the Millers were never seen again. The investigation wasn't just reopening old wounds anymore. It was exposing something deeper, a pattern, a method. And if they were right, the Millers may not have been the only ones. The truth was coming, piece by piece. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it began to feel. And what they would find next might be even harder to face. The air felt heavier now, like something was waiting just beyond reach. Rachel had always known that chasing old cases could be frustrating, but this one felt different. The closer she and Thomas got to the truth, the more the puzzle twisted. It wasn't just about the Miller family anymore. It was about a larger pattern that had stayed hidden in plain sight for too long. Thomas uncovered something in the county archive that chilled them both. Between 1989 and 1994, there were 3 other families in rural Pennsylvania who reported strange visitsmen dressed as officers, asking odd questions, showing up unannounced, then disappearing. None of those families vanished like the Millers. But the timing, the behavior, the remote settings, they all lined up. And in 2 of those cases, the families moved away suddenly, without explaining why. One of them had even changed their last name, left their land behind, and never returned. Rachel made a list and began calling anyone connected to those older cases. Most didn't pick up. A few had died, but one woman answered. Her voice was quiet, and she hesitated before speaking, as if unsure who to trust. She finally told Rachel about a night in late 1991, when a man had come to their home claiming he was there on behalf of the local sheriff. He said there had been reports of missing livestock and needed to check their barn. Her father, suspicious, refused him entry. The man grew tense, but left. A week later, their dog went missing. A few nights after that, her father found a torn piece of uniform caught in the wire fence. They never told anyone. They just packed up and left. That same night, Rachel sat in her car for a long time after leaving the office. Her phone buzzed. It was Thomas. His voice was tight, urgent. He'd been going over aerial images of the Miller farm and the surrounding woods, once taken by the county in the mid-90s for zoning. And he noticed something that wasn't there in later maps. A structure deep in the woods, hidden under trees. not listed in any records, not visible anymore. They'd both combed the area before, but it had either collapsed or been removed. Rachel met him before sunrise, just as fog was lifting off the fields. They moved carefully, cutting through the underbrush, retracing the old map. 40 minutes in, they found what was left of it. It's a collapsed shed or outpost, mostly rotted and covered in vines. But inside, among the rubble, were signs of something once active. Rusted lanterns, footprints in the dirt, and a corner of the floor that looked recently disturbed. Rachel crouched, brushed away the loose earth, and uncovered what looked like an old wooden trapdoor, but not broken. They stared at it, neither of them speaking. The air around them was still, too still. Rachel's heartbeat pounded in her ears. With a deep breath, she pulled the door open. A cold draft swept. Upward stairs, made of stone, descended into darkness. They didn't go down, not yet. Rachel marked the spot, took photos, and secured the entrance. They needed backup. They needed this done right. But something else happened that morning. As they walked back to the car, a noise cut through the silence and engine in the distance. Not a farm vehicle, something heavier. They ducked low behind the trees, watching as a dark SUV rolled slowly down the nearby service road. It passed by the main road, stopped briefly near the fence line, then reversed and drove off. No plates, no markings. Someone had been watching. Someone knew. That night, Rachel didn't go home. She stayed at the station, going over the footage, tracing every name, every record, every gap. She felt time slipping. If someone was trying to erase this again, they had to act fast. But even now, questions swirled. Who had used that shed? Why was it hidden? And why were there no official records of any structure in that area? Thomas suggested something neither of them wanted to consider. What if someone from law enforcement, past or present? Rachel stared at the board in front of her, filled with old photos, maps, and handwritten notes. Everything pointed in one direction toward that hidden structure in the woods and whoever had gone to great lengths to keep it a secret. But Thomas's words kept echoing in her head. What if someone on the inside had helped cover this up? The idea wasn't just disturbing, it changed the entire shape of the investigation. If that was true, then everything they had uncovered might already be known by someone else. Someone who was keeping quiet for a reason? The next morning, Rachel received a sealed envelope at the front desk. No return address, just her name written in neat block letters. Inside was a photograph. A grainy shot, clearly old, showing the Miller children standing beside their father in front of the barn. At first glance, it seemed harmless, just a family picture. But in the background, behind the fence line, was a shadowed figure. Someone partially obscured by trees, standing, completely still, watching. Rachel had never seen this photo before. On the back was a date, July 1992, just weeks before the family vanished. She immediately ran the image through every enhancement filter available, but the face remained unclear. The figure looked like a man in uniform, but the details were too distorted. Still, the presence in the image was undeniable. Someone had been watching them, and this photo was proof. But the bigger question now was who had sent it, and why now? That same day, Thomas received a message from a burner email address, tipping him off to another name, someone who used to work in the records division back in the early 90s. A man named Vernon Pike. He'd retired early and moved out to a cabin not far from the county border. Rachel and Thomas decided to make the drive, keeping it quiet. No backup, no alerts. When they arrived, the place looked abandoned. Weeds climbed the porch steps, windows were fogged over, and the mailbox was overflowing. But as they knocked on the door, a voice from inside called out, low and uncertain, "Go away." Rachel identified herself as law enforcement, And after a long silence, the door opened a crack. Vernon Pike looked like a man who hadn't slept in years. His eyes were sunken, his hands trembled slightly. He let them in without speaking. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old coffee. Papers were scattered everywhere, folders, photographs, notebooks. It didn't take long before Rachel saw the familiar names: Miller, Lance, and even the officer who reported the lost badge. Vernon finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I kept copies. I knew they'd tried to erase it all, but I couldn't forget." He explained that in 1992, shortly after the Millers vanished, he'd been told to pull all files related to the family and send them to a private storage facility, not the county archive. At first, he didn't question it. But when he saw what had been marked confidential letters, community complaints, maps, even the badge report, he knew something was wrong. He had kept copies, hidden away, fearing someone would come after him if they found out. Then he reached for a folder, hands shaking, and slid it across the table. Inside was a report stamped with a logo Rachel didn't recognize, an old task force unit linked to rural surveillance efforts. It wasn't part of the county or even the state. It was federal. That moment shifted everything. If federal eyes had been on the Amish communities, it meant the Millers' disappearance might have been caught up in something much bigger than anyone had imagined. Rachel flipped through the documents, trying to breathe. There were notes about unmonitored settlements, possible alternative lifestyle risks, and flagged individuals for refusal to cooperate with outside agencies. Thomas leaned over, his face pale. This wasn't just one person going rogue. This was organized, planned. Rachel stood slowly, her mind racing. The shadow figure in the photo, the badge, the unlisted building, even the altered land ownership, it all pointed to something far more calculated. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was a deliberate disappearance, possibly under the guise of national security. And if that was true, then whoever orchestrated it had access to resources, connections, and ways to erase entire paper trails without leaving a trace. But then, Vernon Pike said something neither of them expected. They came back once. Maybe. 6 years after it happened, I saw someone watching my house. Oh. They wanted to know if I still had the files. He pointed toward the back of the cabin. That's when I knew I had to go quiet. But I think someone else has started digging again, and I think they're watching you now. Rachel and Thomas left the cabin with copies of everything Pike had shared. They didn't speak until they were halfway back. The silence in the car felt loud, and the weight of what they had just learned pressed against them. If someone with power had hidden this for over a decade, what were they willing to do now to keep it buried? That night, Rachel returned home to find her front door slightly open. Nothing appeared stolen, no signs of forced entry. But the files she had printed earlier, the ones with aerial maps and the Miller timelines, were gone. Just those. Her laptop was untouched. Jewelry, untouched. It wasn't a robbery. It was a message. Thomas called 20 minutes later. His office had been broken into as well. His backup drives, the ones with the old case interviews, were missing. Whatever they were close to, they weren't alone anymore. Someone knew. Someone was already moving to shut it all down. And somewhere in the back of Rachel's mind, a quiet dread took hold. The shed in the woods, the trapdoor, a cold air. They hadn't gone down yet, but soon they would. And what they found waiting at the bottom might not just reveal the truth, could change everything. Rachel stood at the edge of the woods, staring down at the trapdoor again. The morning air was thick with fog, the sun not yet strong enough to cut through it. Everything felt heavier now, her steps, her thoughts, even the silence. This was it. There were no more delays, no more leads to chase. Whatever had been hiding beneath this piece of land for all these years was finally going to be uncovered. Thomas stood beside her, holding a flashlight, his face pale but steady. They both knew the risks, but the truth had waited long enough. She gripped the rusted handle and pulled open the trapdoor. Cold air spilled out, carrying a scent of damp, earth, and something older. They descended slowly, the stone steps creaking under their weight. The tunnel below was narrow, with walls reinforced by rotting beams and traces of what looked like long-abandoned wiring. The flashlight beam flicked across crates, broken lanterns, and stacks of forgotten equipment. But then, at the end of the tunnel, they found a steel door, bolted. Rachel reached for the old release lever and gave it a hard pull. The door groaned open. Inside, they found what looked like a command post, decades old, but still intact. Maps lined the walls, detailed layouts of the surrounding land. Notes scrawled in faded ink, markings over certain Amish homes, including the Miller farm. There were file stacks of them labeled with names Rachel recognized: Miller, Lance, even Pike, and then a locked filing cabinet in the corner. She forced it open with a crowbar she'd brought just in case. Inside were tape surveillance footage, audio logs, and photographs taken through long lenses. Everything pointed to one thing: the Miller family had been watched for months, maybe longer, as part of a covert program run under the cover of community monitoring. One of the tapes had a date: August 9, 1992, the day after the Millers were last seen. Rachel pressed play on a nearby recorder. The audio crackled, then voices filled the space. A man speaking calmly, giving instructions. Load them quietly. No resistance. Another voice responded. The father agreed. Thought we were there. To help. The tape went silent after that, but the implication was clear. They hadn't run. They hadn't been taken by force in the way most feared. They had been misled, tricked by someone wearing the right clothes, using the right words. Rachel stood frozen. All this time, the truth was buried under a lie that sounded official. The man in uniform wasn't rogue. He was part of a sanctioned program that no longer existed, decommissioned, scrubbed from public records. The Miller family had been relocated, under the guise of witness protection, for a purpose that was never fully explained. But the records ended there. No follow-up, no location, no further contact. It was as if the program ended and the Millers vanished with it. Thomas scanned the rest of the room and found one more file marked Termination Protocol. Inside was a final report dated 1994, listing the relocation site as Unit 7. Archive facility, followed by a code string and a stamp. Inactive, access restricted. Rachel took a deep breath. It was a resolution, but not a full one. The Millers were alive when they left, and someone had authorized it. But what happened after? They backed out of the bunker and sealed it behind them, documenting everything. Rachel contacted a federal contact she trusted, sharing the location and demanding answers. Within hours, black SUVs arrived, not to silence them, but to recover the records. This time, there was no more hiding. Officials confirmed a defunct federal task force had operated in the area under extreme secrecy in the early 90s. Its purpose: monitor closed communities for potential threats during a period of rising paranoia. The Miller family had been mistakenly flagged during an internal sweep and relocated for their safety. But the site where they were taken had long since been abandoned after the program collapsed. Rachel pressed for more. When finally got coordinates. A remote site in northern Montanong, forgotten, surrounded by forest. She and Thomas made the trip, accompanied by a federal team. The facility was in ruins, overgrown and barely standing. But tucked in the back was a small sealed residence, built underground. When they opened it, they found records. And something no one expected. A journal. It belonged to Mary Miller. In careful handwriting, she wrote about being taken to a safe location after being told the community was in danger. She mentioned confusion, fear, but also hope. She talked about the children adapting, Eli staying strong. Then the entries stopped abruptly. The last page was torn. That night, Rachel sat by the fire, the journal in her lap. She didn't speak for a long time. It was clear now they'd been alive, maybe for years. But no one had checked on them after the program shut down. No one even knew they were there. The system failed them twice, first by taking them, and then by forgetting them. Just as Rachel stood to leave, a ranger approached from the search team. "You should see this," he said. He handed her a photo, weathered but intact. It showed a woman and 5 children standing near a garden with mountains in the background. At first, Rachel didn't understand. Then she saw the youngest child older now, but the same eyes as the baby in the Miller family photo from 1992. "They lived here," the ranger said quietly. "Neighbors say they left maybe 5 years ago, packed everything and disappeared into the forests. Left no trail." Rachel didn't say anything. There it was, the final twist. The Millers had survived, but now they were gone again. This time by choice. And maybe that was how they wanted it. She looked at the mountains in the distance and whispered, "They're still out there." Rachel stood quietly at the edge of the tree line, the cold Montana wind brushing against her face as she stared out at the abandoned cabin nestled in the clearing. Everything inside had been left neatly, as if the family that once lived there had stepped out for a walk and never returned. Plates were stacked, blankets folded. The garden outside had gone wild, but you could still see the care in how it had once been tended. There was no doubt in her mind anymore. The Miller family had been here. They had survived. As the investigation closed in, pieces of the story began to take final shape. What had started as a missing Amish family case turned out to be a quiet tragedy woven into a hidden chapter of government history. The program that flagged the Millers wasn't meant to hurt people, but it had. Designed in secrecy during a time of fear, the surveillance effort had targeted communities that resisted outside involvement. The Amish, with their silence and self-sufficiency, had become unintended targets. The Millers were taken because someone thought they were hiding something. In reality, they were just living as they always had, simple, peaceful, and away from the noise of the outside world. The Miller children had likely grown up in isolation, far from everything they once knew. They had adapted, learned, and eventually made the decision to disappear on their own terms. Whether they still lived in the forest or moved on under new names, no one could say for sure. And maybe that was the most powerful part of it. After everything they'd been through, the Millers had reclaimed their story in a world that had once stolen it. Rachel filed her final report weeks later, attaching everything they had uncovered: documents, photos, audio tapes, and Mary Miller's journal. The federal task force was officially acknowledged and declassified, and public statements were made. There was no admission of wrongdoing, just the usual statements about past operations and learning from history. But people paid attention. Media coverage told the story with caution, honoring the Miller family's privacy while highlighting the truth behind their vanishing. The search keywords Amish family disappearance, 1992 Miller case, and hidden federal program began trending online, bringing attention to similar cases that had long gone ignored. Thomas's blog exploded with readers. He handled the attention with quiet resolve, careful not to sensationalize the family's story. He focused on the facts, on the real people behind the mystery. He even managed to find a distant relative of the Millers who now lived out of state. They declined an interview, but shared that the family had reached out once, briefly, just to say they were safe. No address, no names. Just peace. Back in Pennsylvania, the old Miller farmhouse was finally closed up for good. The Amish community came together one last time to say a silent farewell. Rachel attended the quiet gathering, standing among the rows of buggies and straw hats. feeling the weight of what had been carried all these years. Caleb Miller stood beside her, now a grown man with children of his own. He spoke softly about his cousins, about the memory of laughter on the porch, of his aunt's kind voice and the way Eli used to hum while working the fields. He said he believed they were still together somewhere, living simply, just as they always wanted. Samuel Yoder passed away not long after. His discovery of the police vest had reignited everything. He was remembered as a gentle man with sharp eyes and a steady heart. His family kept his Bible and the small hand-carved box where he'd kept the vest, now empty but full of meaning. His actions had mattered. He had broken the silence. As time went on, Rachel moved on to other cases, but the Miller story never quite left her. It stayed in the way she approached every new file, every closed-door policy, every missing report that didn't feel right. The lesson wasn't just about what had been done, was about what had been ignored. Sometimes the loudest truths live in the quietest places. Sometimes a family disappears not because they're lost, but because they've been failed by the systems meant to protect them. Thomas kept writing. His articles reached wider audiences. He spoke at conferences about ethical journalism and the responsibility of telling stories like the Millers with care. He never stopped wondering if they might reach out again. But they didn't. And he respected that one autumn afternoon, almost a year after the bunker had been discovered, Rachel returned to Montana. She didn't alert the press. She didn't even tell Thomas. She just walked the path to the old cabin, now marked as historical. Property, protected but untouched. She stood in the garden, overgrown and tangled, and felt something she hadn't before closure. Not the kind with answers written in ink, but the kind you feel deep in your bones. She left a small wooden plaque at the gate. It read, "Peace, wherever you are." The story of the Miller family would always have gap spaces no one could fill, but the truth had finally surfaced, and with it came a kind of justice. They had not vanished without a trace. They had not been forgotten. In the end, the world finally saw them. Not just as a mystery to solve, but as a family who once lived and loved, and chose to step away from a world that failed to understand them. And somewhere out there, among the trees, maybe there's still a fire burning quietly. Maybe Eli hums. While stacking wood, maybe Mary kneads dough with soft hands. Maybe the children laugh while chasing shadows through the forest. And maybe that's the ending they wanted all along.